So good morning, everyone from Vancouver. My colleagues at Genome BC and I are incredibly grateful to work, live, and play on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. So welcome to Genome BC Data Literacy webinar series. We started this series back in the fall, shortly following the launch of our data science strategy at Genome BC, and we aim to bring to you national and international experts to help our collective understanding of different data-related initiatives, standards, resources, issues. And today in particular, we are very grateful to our colleague at Genome Canada for their presentation on the key themes and findings from the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy consultations. And of course, I'm sure they'll tell us about some of their upcoming Genome Canada initiative. I will now pass it over to Zsuzsanna Olander, who is our Director of Data Science at Genome BC. Welcome and enjoy.
Thank you, Federica. I just wanted to let you know, those of you in the audience, that starting September, we will have a sort of a mini series within this seminar series focused on artificial intelligence. We will begin with a presentation detailing the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy, featuring Go Wang from the Vector Institute. And we will continue then through the fall and early winter with presentation by experts on machine learning, deep learning, and natural language processing. Now back to today's presentation. As Federica mentioned, we have the pleasure of having Genome Canada speakers today. Corey Johnston is the Vice President, Policy and Public Affairs. Corey leads Genome Canada's federal advocacy and policy agenda. Guided by the belief that genomics can change the world if responsibly and equitably applied, Corey builds strategic partnerships among diverse stakeholders to advance the role and impact of genomics in society. Dr. Karen Dewar is Associate Vice President, Genomics Program. Karen oversees Genome Canada's large-scale genomics programs and genomic applications partnership program. She is regularly involved in discussions with our partners and collaborators about programs, guidelines, and policies, scientific evaluation, and peer review processes. Over to you, Corey and Karen.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to Federica, Zsuzsanna, and the whole team at Genome BC for the very kind invitation to be with you all today as part of these the data literacy series. I'm a big fan of the work that Genome BC is doing in this area, and Karen and I are both really grateful to be here. I first also want to acknowledge that Genome Canada is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. I know we have folks from across the country joining in today, and I would encourage you all to reflect on the land in which you are working, living, and playing today as well. Genome Canada recognizes our commitment to redress the historic and ongoing inequities as a result of colonization, and we are committed to reconciliation and bringing a more equitable approach to the genomics research landscape. I want to first say that Karen and I are going to be tag teaming a little bit this morning. We have a presentation that we'll go through and hope to have quite a bit of time for questions at the end. I'm going to take the first part of the presentation to really set some strategic context for the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy and what came out of the consultations last spring. This is then going to be followed by an overview by Karen of some of Genome Canada's strategic directions as it relates to our new challenge-driven approach. So perhaps we can go to the first slide. So our purpose today is to really walk through and share with you and hopefully leave you with a bit of a deeper understanding of the themes that have come out of the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy consultations led by our Federal Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, and the National Research Council. Genome Canada and the regional genome centers were major partners in contributing to the consultations, And I'm going to be giving a bit of a flavor of some of the key findings that came out of the government's What We Heard report. But first, I thought it might be important just to set a bit of context for why the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy and why now. First of all, I think many of us who are hopefully around this virtual table this morning know that Canada is a real world leader in the area of genomics, having invested in over 20 years through Genome Canada and the regional genome centers and other partners like the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and the federal government itself through the National Research Council and science-based departments. We have built up a very strong genomics expertise in human health and in non-human health areas such as agricultural, natural resources, and the applications of genomics technologies. The science and the technologies are fast changing. It's a very fast evolving field, and the government decided in budget 2021 to announce the creation of a Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy to really mobilize all of the investments in genomics research and talent and capacity and infrastructure over the past 2 decades to drive greater downstream impact, both for the Canadian economy and Canadians' well-being. And so the announcement was made in budget 2021 to invest $400 million over 6 years in this new Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy to be developed by the government in consultation with key stakeholders. As part of that investment, Genome Canada was pleased to receive $136.7 million in our challenge-driven approach, which is really marshalling genomics capacities to address key challenges faced by Canada and the world. And Karen will speak to that more in depth a little later in our presentation. And the announcement of the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy was also really in recognition of the importance of key platform technologies like artificial intelligence and like quantum, which also have benefited from national strategies being developed by the federal government. Susanna alluded to the Pan-Canadian Strategy earlier. And the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy will be sort of the third leg in this stool of national strategies to really capitalize on critical platform technologies to drive the future economy and Canadians' well-being in Canada. As I mentioned, this strategy is really intended to focus on where Canada can advance translation and commercialization of genomics and related technologies. It's also really intended to focus on where Canadian genomics can play a global leadership role and to position the country to seize the opportunities of the bioeconomy. And finally, to find ways to have enhanced coordination across the ecosystem. The work has been in development over the last number of months following consultations last spring, and it's anticipated that Minister Champagne of the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development will announce the new strategy sometime later this fall. We'll go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the government held a number of consultations last spring to ensure that they were hearing from the broad Canadian community right across the country to inform the strategy development. And certainly Genome Canada and our 6 genome centers were very active in both the consultations and developing a submission on behalf of our group that really built on an initiative we had led over the fall of 2021 called the National Dialogue Series on Canada's Genomics Future. We worked with the Genome Centers to host a series of engagements in fall 2021. If anyone is interested, the report from our work in that area is on our website. And that really helped inform our submission into the federal government's consultations. They held a series of thematic roundtables with industry, research, not-for-profit partners, as well as an online survey. And we're very pleased to have heard from over 470 Canadians in total through this exercise. And as I mentioned, Genome Canada and the Genome Centers were very active in all the consultations and put in a submission. We'll go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now over the next couple of slides is drill down into some of the key pillars that were themes that came out of the consultations that are part of the What We Heard report developed by the federal government. That report was released in March, and it is on their website if you're interested in more details. But I'm going to speak to three particular themes. The first being the strong theme of talent that was a key part of what they heard from Canadians and Canadian partners in the genomics community with respect to developing the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy. As we know, Canada is in a global competition for advanced talent in many areas of science and technology, and genomics is no exception. And certainly what was heard in the consultations was the continuing need to ensure that Canada is investing in developing the next generation of data scientists, bioinformaticians, genetic counselors, all sorts of areas that are really important to the genomics strategy. But also there was three strong messages that in addition to developing the technical skills of the next generation of genomics leaders, it's also important to ensure that there's multidisciplinary training as well that ensures that business skills, communication skills, the ethics and the genomics and society implications of this science and technology are really built into training. As well, there was a strong message around the need to diversify the talent pipeline in Canada and to ensure that students and those interested in genomics from equity-deserving groups, from Indigenous communities, from new Canadians who are coming to our country are also really engaged in part of the training opportunities to ensure that our talent pool is not only robust, but diverse as well. And finally, to start that early, that there's a strong sense that it's too late to only focus on genomics literacy and training when folks hit post-secondary, and to work with partners that are working in science education with the younger generations through K-12 to really spark an interest in the careers that are available in the genomics space. And here, of course, Genome BC's been doing a terrific work with Gene School as an example of that. And finally, the strong message heard was let's do more to connect genomics students and scholars and researchers with employers. How can we bridge more work-integrated opportunities or work-related opportunities with employers through such bridge programs such as MyTax or others to ensure that the talent pipeline is being integrated in with the private sector or public sector to really apply the learnings from their post-secondary education. So those were some key themes from the talent pillar of the What We Heard report. We'll go to the next slide to talk about some of the findings on the data pillar. So data was an absolutely key theme in the consultations on the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy. What was heard and captured in the report were some of the challenges facing the Canadian genomics data ecosystem. There was a lot of concern about its ongoing fragmentation and the challenges that many of the data sets being created are siloed right now and not as connected as they could be. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to improve areas with respect to data sharing, data standards, interoperability, and access beyond, for example, access to connect research and clinical data, access by private sector partners with some of the data sets being created by researchers. And certainly this is something that we all experienced through the COVID pandemic as it relates to our Canadian COVID-19 Genomics Network, CanCaGen, where we worked with a Pan-Canadian network of partners to respond to creating a national genomics viral surveillance network. And a huge issue was around data sharing, both across partners, academic and clinical partners and public health authorities, but also across provinces. So this issue was very much a theme that came up during the consultations. And also the important point of aligning our work with the international data standards and of other countries and other global organizations. So some of the suggestions that came out of the consultations related to the importance of Canada looking at a federated data ecosystem model as a way to connect up different data sets and to create more interoperable standards and more and streamlined approaches to data sharing. Another point was how can we leverage some of the global expertise and the global reputation of organizations like the GA4GH and ensure that it is playing a key role in the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy. And finally, are there opportunities to create more national data repositories or connect up existing data sets so that we can maximize the benefits from these? We can certainly touch on any of these points in the Q&A. We'll go to the next slide, please. The other last pillar I'll speak to relates to ecosystem coordination to enhance implementation, adoption, and commercialization of genomic science and technologies. As mentioned earlier, one of the key challenges in Canada is the fact that we have a strong capacity, strong talent, infrastructure, and strengths in genomics, but it is quite a disconnected ecosystem. And so a lot of what was heard in the strategy consultations were how can there be improved coordination across the ecosystem? How can we have, through this strategy, a strong national vision, and how can we connect up and improve collaboration across the key players and investors, as well as the academic and research, public and private sectors, and community sectors? And how can funding opportunities and supports be improved or created to ensure that we're investing in genomics right from basic research through to commercialization? And another point I wanted to just touch on too was the point around public engagement and education. It became clear during the consultations that there's an opportunity for greater public engagement and focus on genomics literacy among the general public, but also among key economic sectors where there's not a real recognition of the importance that genomics can play in innovating their resource sectors, whether it's mining, forestry, aquaculture, et cetera, where we actually have a lot of strengths in Canada, but still not a great understanding among those industries of how genomics can play a role. So certainly there's a strong sense that more can be done to improve public education and outreach. Again, this has been a real strength of Genome BC and many of the genome centers across the country who are really doing a lot of this work. And how can we scale that? Because the public is very supportive. We have done some public opinion polling, as has Genome BC, of Canadians' views on genomics technologies, and they're very supportive, particularly when it links to applications that improve their daily lives. If anyone's interested, we have some polling data on our website that you're welcome to take a look at that we did last year. And finally, before I move to the next part of our presentation, if we could just go to the next slide, the What We Heard report talked about some key sectoral areas where the folks participating in the consultations really think Canada could focus on and double down on. These opportunities were in the health area, the human health area, where Canada is already, and certainly Genome Canada and the Genome Centers have invested over half of our funding over the last 20 years in the area of health and genomics. And where can we go next with respect to precision health and medicine in this country? Other areas, and again, this is a real Canadian strength, were identified in agriculture and agri-food and in applications to the environment. This is quite unique in the world, as many of us know, where Canada has took a multi-sectoral approach to our genomic strengths right from the beginning to double down on these sectors and where genomics can be applied. So the consultations really underscored we need to do more here. And synthetic biology was identified as a really important emerging area where Canada should be focusing. We're seeing this a lot in the US and the UK, where engineering biology has really been identified as a critical technology of the future. Our partners and friends at Ontario Genomics are hosting, in fact, in a couple of weeks, their 5th annual Synthetic Bio Conference, and have really been spearheading our work across the country to strengthen Canada's approach in synthetic biology. So that was also identified as an area of focus. And finally, the idea of creating strategic initiatives as part of the strategy to really mobilize the community around some key challenges and priority areas for Canada was recommended as a priority. So I'll go to, just before I close and hand off things to Karen, I'm just going to speak to a little bit where Genome Canada is with our Strategic Science Fund initiative as well. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just to close on the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy and the What We Heard report, as I said, I've given you a bit of an overview of what came out of the federal government's report. And we hope that the strategy would, as I said, be announced by the minister this fall. And at the same time, for those that are interested, Genome Canada put in our vision for our future through the Strategic Science Fund this year, and we're awaiting the results, which would provide 5 years of sustainable funding to our organization to drive 3 strategic objectives, many of which, as you will have seen, are very aligned with the themes that came out of the consultations of the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy. To really drive ecosystem leadership and coordination, to marshal the Canadian genomics community around genomics grand challenges, and to accelerate adoption, implementation, and commercialization of genomics by working with end user groups and partners in the impact areas of human and public health, climate, environment, and biodiversity, and improve food security. And that we would want to marshal this through cross-cutting activities in data and technology infrastructure, inclusive genomics, policy and public engagement, talent and skills, and global engagement. So really hoping to align our vision for our strategic directions with the outcomes of the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy to ensure it will be a success. So with that, I'm going to hand over things to my colleague, Karen, who's going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the areas of our investments and focus.
Thank you, Perry. Can you skip to the next slide as well? As mentioned, in recent years, Genome Canada has adopted a challenge-driven approach, which is really focused on national impact. And I think the approach has some key goals in which we're trying to achieve. And these goals are really key research investments focused on areas of strategic importance for Canada and internationally. A goal to mobilize research and innovation to bring together expertise at the intersection of genomics and society, and to develop Canadian skills and talents. Also coordinating and connecting researchers with other stakeholders, such as business leaders, policymakers, to try and tackle complex challenges with an innovation-based approach. And this will be done through supporting portfolios of programs, which will be co-created with our major partners, the genome centers, but also other key partners and stakeholders. And I think for this particular audience, what's also really important is in terms of data, one of the key elements of Genome Canada's challenge-driven approach is to ensure that data that's generated can be shared across projects and be used to drive towards impact. And as Perry noted, this would try and address some of the siloed data systems that was identified in the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenge-driven models that Genome Canada has used for a number of initiatives. The first one, that you can change the slide. The next slide, yes. Okay, so the first one is the All for One Canada's Precision Health Partnership. So this initiative is aimed at advancing precision health across Canada to allow for increased equitable and timely access to accurate clinical genomics, particularly for children and and adults that are suffering with rare diseases. It's made up of 3 main elements. There's the clinical implementation projects. There are 6 regional projects across the country that are looking at how to implement genomic testing for rare diseases into the healthcare system. There's a policy toolkit, which is critically looking at the models and frameworks for data governance for consent and sharing across the projects. And then there's a health data ecosystem, which is really to set up a site to share data for clinical research purposes. Next slide, please. Another of our challenge-driven initiatives was the Pan-Canadian, Canada's COVID-19 Genomics Network. And the goal of this initiative was to establish a coordinated Pan-Canadian Genomics Network for large-scale SARS-CoV and human host sequencing to track viral origins of spread and evolution and characteristics of human genetics in COVID-19 disease. So there were 2 main elements: VirusSeq, which was focused on tracking the virus sequencing, and HostSeq, which was looking at the impact of SARS-CoV on human participants. I think what's important to point out that although there were many challenges associated with the sharing of data from Pan-Canadian, a lot of this data has actually been used to form the foundation of other initiatives. For example, HostSeq, the data collected in HostSeq is the part of the foundation for the Human Genome Library, which has been launched by Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Next slide. So with Pan-Canadian, Genome Canada worked really closely with a number of partners, including Canadian institutions, the Canadian Genomic Enterprise, public health labs, university labs, and hospital labs. And I think what was one of the key takeaways was the importance of having these networks across the country in order to be able to deliver on genomics for the surveillance. Next slide, please. So here I'm talking about some of our more recent challenge-driven initiatives. And the first one I'll talk about is the Climate Action Genomics Initiative with a focus on the climate-smart agriculture and food systems. This initiative was launched a year ago, and the goal of the initiative is to invest in cutting-edge genomics research and innovation to help reduce the carbon footprint of Canada's food production systems, to build resilience, environmental stability, and economic viability for the sector. It again is made up of actually 2 main elements: the interdisciplinary challenge teams, which are large teams of research projects that are addressing specific questions to deliver innovative genomic solutions to help support climate change mitigation, and 2 cross-connecting hubs, a hub that is focused on knowledge mobilization and implementation, and a hub that's focused on data coordination, collaboration. Next slide. So really, this is an approach of looking at a portfolio and how this portfolio can really drive towards impact. And so this demonstrates the interconnectivity of each of these elements within the initiative. The 9 ICT projects will interact with the 2 hubs, the Knowledge Mobilization Implementation Hub, to help drive knowledge mobilization activities, and will interact with the Data Coordination Center on data sharing, data standards. The data, DCC data will be utilized to drive climate impacts, and the knowledge mobilization will leverage and expand ICT and the data coordination outputs. So they all work together and connect together, hopefully to drive towards impact on the climate. Next slide. And in this model, we had 2 separate hubs, as noted, but the 2 hubs are intended to work closely together, and the whole can be greater than the sum. So there is a collection of independent projects that need the glue, intentional integration and focus to synergize towards achieving a common object. And the hubs will support the coordination of the project research activities, adding value added to project outputs, and to help address any gaps that might have been created to really achieve coherence of the portfolio. Next slide, please. So the next initiative is actually one that's just recently been launched. It's the Genomic Monitoring of Pathogens in Water initiative, and it was only launched last month. And it will set up a Pan-Canadian collaboration to help monitor emerging pathogens and antimicrobial resistant bacteria and genes. And it's being set up to look at this from a One Health perspective. So the initiative is made up of 3 main elements. And this, we have learned lessons from our previous initiatives. And in this initiative, we're actually starting with the collaboration hubs first, and then we'll support the regional emerging pathogen and antimicrobial resistant project teams. But the first funding opportunity that was launched was the Community Coordination Collaboration Hub. And this really is to develop it's a cross-cutting funding to develop and launch an implementation plan, which includes data governance, management, knowledge mobilization, and international alignment and collaboration. And this will work the hub will work and support the regional teams, which will be teams of researchers working across the country to monitor emerging pathogens or AMR resistance. And they'll work in partnership with academics and public users. And what is also unique and new about this initiative is that we are working very closely with Indigenous-led communities to co-create and co-develop an Indigenous-led surveillance project in northern and remote communities. So this one is it's a new way for us to work with Indigenous communities, and is really going to take a lot of working together, helping understand the needs of the communities, working to really co-create this funding initiative. So we don't have a deadline for when this will be launched. It will very much depend upon when the communities are ready to develop and respond to this. Last slide. So looking ahead, we have already, as mentioned, investments in health, food, agriculture, environment, and climate. Our focus is really on data sharing, governance, privacy, and access, as we recognize that without really addressing the issues of data sharing, data standards, data visualization, and the governance of data, that the impact from our investments will not be able to reach their full potential. We really want to ensure that whatever we do has a focus on inclusive genomics and developing novel ways in which we can do that and ensure that genomics is not just for those that are that have generally been included, but to ensure that we are reaching out and including other communities. The areas such as engineering, biology, and circular bioeconomy are areas we're looking at. And I think there's also some of the genomics in society around misinformation, policy regulation, public engagement are areas of importance to us, as well as international cooperation and coordination, as we recognize that Canada is only a small country on its own, and particularly for some of the areas that we really want to have an impact, it's critically important that we have international, we're linked into the international community and find the best ways in which we can do that. So I think just thank you very much for listening, and I know both Perry and I would be really happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Pari and Karen. Coming from the data science side, and as our audience is obviously data focused, I was so glad to see that there is a separate data pillar in the report. So that's really good that the community has voiced the need for doing something about the fragmented data ecosystem, access to data, obviously, and infrastructure has been a struggle for those of us working in translational research. So it's good that it's being recognized, and hopefully there is going to be more done in that respect. Of course, also seeing that even within the training pillar, data scientist and bioinformatician training is key, was nice to see. So I think all those things we knew about, and it's good that it was also recognized in this report, and hopefully something is going to be done. It was also really good to see in Karen's slides that Genome Canada is doing more about the data access, data integration, data governance standards, and all of that through the last couple of programs that have been launched. So all of those are great news for the data science community. And so with that, I'll start calling out the questions that have come up through the Q&A. And those of you in the audience, please feel free to still ask your questions as we have about 20 minutes to answer them. And I think this first question is for Karen. Will the hubs be ongoing for future competitions?
So I think that's a great question. And really, it's one that we have been thinking about. There's actually, it sort of links into the next question about the different hubs for different initiatives and how they can be sustained. So we really, I mean, the key piece that we're trying to ensure with our initiatives are that we're not just supporting individual projects. We are supporting a group of projects that are working together towards drive towards impact. And the hub model was a model that we felt was a way that we could actually help drive this, bring the individual projects together, provide means to standardize their data, to help them share, to really address some of those cross-cutting elements within the different projects. However, I think what we have recognized is that it may not make sense to continue to support hubs for every initiative if there are already structures that are in place. So one of the things we're really looking very closely at is how can we really utilize the support and the functions and structures that are already out there to help us address it, to help us really maximize what our investments will be to address these cross-cutting areas. And really looking, is the hub model the right model for every initiative? Is there a way that we can actually bring hubs together or provide support for existing hubs to help them deliver on some of the other initiatives? So it's certainly something we will look very carefully at, and I think it's something that we would appreciate also input from the community on how to do that. It is new, and I think we want to make sure that we are really responding to the community and responding to the needs of the community. So we're very appreciative if there's ideas and thoughts on how we can achieve this.
Thank you, Karen. It's definitely not an easy solution, I think, but you know, we are at least going and doing something about it. So I think that it was a great first step to start with each of those competitions or programs to have a data component that is quite substantial. And so obviously in the report, it was mentioned that equity, diversity, and inclusion is very important. And I think the next question is related to that. And it was related to also the program that Karen had mentioned. Will the work with Indigenous communities be coordinated with the federal government's food security program for remote communities?
Maybe I can start and then I can hand it over to Perry. Absolutely, I think what's really important is that any work that we do in this area, we don't do alone, and that we do it with the lens of what is happening in the government, what's happening in the regions, and really in co-development with different Indigenous communities. So whether we'll work directly with the federal government's food security program or not, I mean, that's certainly, we will be working closely with a number of different groups and stakeholders to try and ensure what we're doing is not happening in isolation.
Yes. Perry, I don't know if you have anything to add, otherwise I'll go to the next question.
Yeah, I think we can go on. I think you heard really well.
Okay, so maybe one more question for Karen. How will researchers be incentivized, required to share data in a timely manner?
That's another great question. And we've talked a lot about carrots and sticks, and we just actually had a really interesting meeting in Montreal last week with the health community, and some of these questions came up then. And I think we do need to both incentivize positively by showing the value of sharing, but I think we also need to have a bit of a heavy hand in some ways and bake this into some of our agreements so that some of the conditions for funding are actually tied to being able to share. I know that there are different models for a more positive incentives. I mean, one of the models could be that groups get paid by how much data they share. So when they share the data, they actually get paid for that data that's been generated and shared. And I think there's a number of different models we can perhaps look at to see what could work most effectively.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's something that we've been also thinking a lot about at Genome BC, and Mohammed, who's on the data science team here, has been updating our data management and sharing guidelines. And so we had quite intense discussions about how do we incentivize. And as Karen mentioned, obviously, if we provide, or even, slightly different, but we provide a financial incentive, at least for the time that's spent on putting the data together. Obviously that's time sensitive. It takes quite a bit of time to do this right. And so compensating that, we're also thinking of having a data sharing award potentially that could get people more excited about sharing their data. But, we're also working on a metadata commons. And so in my view also, there is, this greater good. We are putting together a resource for the research community. And as researchers, you have the obligation, but also the opportunity to use those resources. But if you don't put your own data, then if others do the same, then that resource is not going to be out there. So I think researchers do understand that, and CIHR and others are moving towards creating more of this data sharing sort of perspective in the community. So hopefully working together, this is not going to be a question of how, but just, when, and hopefully really soon.
So I think we do have to also recognize, and I think this is something that we have to take into consideration, is around, and sort of gets to one of the next questions, around ownership of data as well. And certainly for First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit, the data governance and ownership of their own data is actually very critically important. So whatever data sharing policies, processes, incentives we have, we also need to recognize that there are situations where that there has to be a voice as well from those that actually own the data around what can be shared, and maybe novel ways to think about how we can share data and respect ownership and governance.
Yeah, excellent point, Karen. That's definitely, there is going to be like, share your data, but, there has to be some points there, because, obviously the First Nations, Inuit and Métis are one example, but I could also see working with industry sometimes it can be a trickier, around data sharing as well. And that may have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So going to Perry, there was a couple of questions that were answered in the chat, but given this is recorded, I figured I'll read up those questions. So those participants who will be listening to it after the event could also hear this. One question was, will Genome Canada be leading the implementation of the Pan-Canadian Genomics Strategy?
Great, thanks. That great question, and I think the obviously, as I said, with the strategy still under development by our Department of Innovation Science, the National Research Council, we've been part of ongoing dialogue with them about the strategy and how it will come together. We hope that we will play a role in as one of the partners in implementation. I think that that's certainly an area where we can bring some real national leadership and strengths. I think that the opportunity for them too is as they look at other partners, even within government, for example, the Genomics Research and Development Initiative, which is run out of NRC, but it includes about I think 6 science-based departments will also play an important delivery role as well. So I think that is still being determined, but certainly Genome Canada's hope and certainly, you know, how we have brought ideas to the table would certainly, you know, we hope lead to a strong implementation role as one of the partners in the strategy.
And to your point, Ferry, you have already at Genome Canada started to implement some of those things that were mentioned in the report. So it's great. But I also noted that you know, the Digital Research Alliance Canada and others, you know, MyTax have been also mentioned. So there is going to be obviously,
and the Global Alliance. Yes, exactly.
There is going to be a network.
Yes, exactly.
It's too much to be done to be led by one single organization. The other question, I think, was also for Perry. Are there any considerations for adoption and adherence to data standards across projects? Funders can play a role by making funding contingent upon adoption.
Well, I think, and I think Karen touched on this earlier as we look at, you know, the carrots and sticks that funders have to, you know, incentivize change and adherence to certain desired outcomes. That's certainly something that we have been looking at and will continue as we develop our program designs to really drive impact at the end of the day. As Karen noted, that is really the ultimate goal of our investments. And so where there are opportunities to do that. And certainly, as Karen was right, we just had a terrific meeting in Montreal last week with our health and genomics research community that have really, you know, led to incredible impacts through our collective investments over the last number of years. And many of them were encouraging funders like Genome Canada to be thinking in these ways. How can we build in right from the get-go these real incentives for our funded projects. So certainly, yes, that is an area that we're looking at really carefully. Karen may want to add, but I think you know, we felt encouraged by what we heard from our funded research community last week, that we have a responsibility as funders to look at how our programs can help incentivize adoption, adherence, data sharing, all of those pieces. It helps, I think, them in a way too with their own institutions as well. So if we have to look at this carefully as a funder and realize we have our resources that we bring to bear can be used in ways to drive change.
Actually, it was interesting. I think what a number of the researchers pointed out was sometimes they do have barriers at their institution level. And they may have a willingness to share data, but have actually some restrictions, either at the institutional level or at sort of even some of the provincial levels. So although sticks are not usually the way we want to incentivize something, sometimes that actually does help the community, because it helps them address some of the barriers they're facing from others.
Yeah, good point. So we have 5 more minutes to go. We have 2 more questions. So I think that's just about a good way to wrap it up. So what is Genome Canada's strategy relating to emerging sequencing technologies? The person asks Element, Optima, Singular, MGI, and others. Either of you want to take it on?
Karen, do you have any thoughts there?
I mean, I think we're very supportive of new sequencing technologies, and a number of the different types of projects that we have supported over the last little while. Many more of them are starting to use long read sequencing. So I think that if the emerging sequencing technologies can really address the need of the project, we would be very supportive of that. I don't know if the question is more, are we supportive in having programs, or but I I think, you know, with our challenge-driven approach and trying to really address specific problems, there could be future challenges that maybe have a technology development element to them in order to address that challenge. So I think it's really going to depend upon what we're trying to achieve, what the goal is, and what the impact is that we're trying to address.
Yeah, the key is fit for purpose, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the support is there if it makes sense for answering the research question. All right, so there is one last question. Are you envisioning all the future large-scale initiatives or taking the portfolio approach in the application and project management processes? I guess that's another Karen question.
Certainly, our Genome Canada is definitely moving and has moved towards a challenge-driven approach to our large-scale funding. Having said that, though, we also have our Genomic Applications Partnership Program, which we are, because that program, I think, is, I'm trying to think how many years now, but it's been 10 or 11 years that it's been in 10 years and the 100th project that we supported. So it is time that we are looking at the program. There's been an evaluation of it to see that it meets the needs. But that program is currently open. It's not focused on any challenges. It is sort of an open program. I think we are trying to look at how we can make it sort of more strategic, but that is an opportunity, certainly, in addition to the challenge-driven large-scale initiatives that we will be launching in the future.
Thank you. There is actually somebody messaged us directly. Is one last question in 1 minute answer. To what extent does the federal Canadian strategy align with the provincial strategies? And that's probably not an easy question to answer, but maybe Perry.
Terrific question. And I should say too that one of the key engagement opportunities that the federal government had was meeting with federal and provincial territorial partners with respect to where alignment could happen. So certainly that has been there is work to try to align where possible. Certainly. We know that there were similar consultations by the province of Quebec with respect to their genomic strategy, and there was a lot of alignment with certainly Genome Quebec with what had been put into the federal strategy. So certainly there's been ongoing dialogue there to ensure that we are leveraging the strengths and the focus of provincial and regional strategies to roll up into national impact.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was really good to hear what the community had to say about potential strategy. And we're looking forward to seeing when the actual strategy comes out.
So are we.
So yes.
And we're looking forward to the other programs coming from Genome Canada and others that will address said strategy once, we're ready for that. I think it's exciting times for the data community, especially, I feel like, around, our voices being heard more and the need for our expertise. So I'm, thrilled to see what's going to come out of all of this work. But thank you for both of you. And thank you, Genome Canada, for being a huge part of this engagement, the consultation related to the strategy. It's great that you're participating.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and keep up the great work with this series. I'm going to look forward to your fall series on AI. That's excellent.
Thank you so much, both. And thank you, everybody who attended. See you hopefully at our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.